"You're not good enough for my son." Those words hit me like a thunderclap. They didn't come from a stranger, but from the woman who was supposed to be family, my mother-in-law. I had always sensed that she wasn't exactly fond of me, but this was different. This wasn't a casual remark or a subtle hint. This was a statement, a declaration, a reminder that, in her eyes, I wasn't worthy, not good enough for her precious son. I stood there frozen, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. How could she say something like that? I wasn't just his wife. I was the woman he had chosen to build a life with. Yet I realized I wasn't part of her world, the world she had carefully crafted for him. A world where I didn't fit, didn't belong. Her words lingered in the air, but I didn't let them crush me. For years I had known she disapproved of me, but I never imagined it would come to this. She wasn't just criticizing me, she was making her move. She had decided that I wasn't good enough for her son, and in her mind, that was the end of the story. She believed that her power, her influence over Daniel was enough to push me aside. But here's the thing, what she didn't know was that I had already won. The life she thought she controlled, the house she thought was her son's, the world she believed she had built for him, it was all mine. And the moment she thought she could sweep me out of it, she had already sealed her own fate. I didn't tell Daniel about his mother's words that day. I didn't need to. Because while she was busy scheming to push me out, I was quietly preparing for the moment when I would take back everything she thought she could control. The moment when the truth would be revealed, not to Daniel, but to her. And when that moment came, it would be too late. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pancakes filled the house, a typical family brunch we had come to cherish. The sun cast a soft glow through the kitchen windows, painting everything in the hues of gold and amber. I was clearing the table, putting away the last of the dishes, when I caught a glimpse of Margaret, the woman who, despite all her charm, had never really accepted me, watching me carefully, her eyes as sharp as ever. Daniel, my husband, was deep in conversation with his father across the room, laughing at some silly story his dad was telling. His easygoing nature was like a breath of fresh air, always pulling people in, making them feel comfortable, even when the air around us felt thick with tension. What Daniel didn't realize was that there was something brewing in the background, something he had no idea about, something that would soon tear our world apart. Margaret had always been polite, but there was an undercurrent of disdain whenever she looked at me. It wasn't just that I didn't come from the right background, something she'd made clear over the years. It was more personal than that. I was, in her eyes, the woman who had taken her son away, the one who was standing in the way of her perfect plan for his life. And no matter how hard I tried to fit in, it was never enough. "Claire," she called my name, her voice as smooth as silk, yet carrying an undertone of authority. "Can we talk for a moment?" My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I considered ignoring her, but I knew better than to walk away when Margaret called. So, with a forced smile, I walked over to where she stood near the window. Her posture was perfect, her nails manicured, her diamond bracelet gleaming in the soft sunlight. She looked every bit the part of a woman who was in control. I didn't know what to expect, but what she said next took me by surprise. "Claire, dear," she began, her voice taking on an almost condescending sweetness, "I think it's time you let go of Daniel. You've had your fun, but we both know you're not the right fit for our family." The words hit me like a slap. I stood there, my hands frozen in place as I gripped the edge of the countertop, trying to steady myself. My mind raced. Should I confront her? Should I fight back? But I didn't. I just stood there, taking it all in, because I knew that this wasn't just an insult, it was an ultimatum. Margaret had decided that I was the problem, that I wasn't good enough for Daniel, and she was determined to make me leave. "You don't have the right background," she continued, her tone still polite, almost rehearsed. "No prestigious family name, no connections that matter. A woman like you, Claire, only holds a man like Daniel back."
I couldn't help but laugh inwardly. She had no idea how wrong she was.
In the years I'd been with Daniel, I had built a life for myself. A life that, unbeknownst to her, was more successful than anything she could have imagined. The business I started from nothing had grown beyond her wildest dreams, and the house we lived in, the one she adored showing off to her friends, was mine, not Daniel's. She thought she had power, she thought she was in control. But what she didn't know was that everything I had worked for, everything I had built, was far beyond her reach. I exhaled slowly, setting the plates down on the table with precision. Margaret watched me, expecting some kind of emotional breakdown, some sign of defeat, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I simply looked at her and smiled. It wasn't a smile of submission, it was the kind of smile that should have made her uneasy. I understand perfectly, I said softly, then turned and walked away without another word. I could feel her eyes on my back, confused, bewildered by my lack of resistance. But she had no idea that the moment she made her move, the game had already changed. The days following that conversation with Margaret were strangely quiet. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Daniel went to work, his parents were visiting less frequently, and I was busy with my business. But beneath it all, I could feel the tension building. I knew Margaret wouldn't give up that easily. She never did. She had her sights set on Daniel, and she wasn't going to rest until she had him right where she wanted him. It started small, casual remarks, comments veiled in concern. "Claire just doesn't understand our lifestyle, sweetheart," Margaret would say, her voice sweet but carrying an unmistakable undertone. "She doesn't have the background, the connections. You deserve someone who can give you what you need, someone who fits in with our family." I could hear it in her voice every time, the subtle, biting insults disguised as concern. She wanted me to feel like I wasn't enough, like I was standing in the way of her perfect vision for Daniel's life. But I wasn't about to let her win. I watched Daniel laugh off her comments, never suspecting the storm that was quietly brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't that he didn't care, he just didn't see what was happening. He never did. And then came the turning point. One evening, I was cleaning up after dinner when I overheard a conversation that stopped me dead in my tracks. Daniel and Margaret were in the next room, their voices low, but I could hear every word. I had always suspected that she was trying to manipulate him, but hearing it out loud was different. It was like a cold wave of realization crashing over me. "She's not right for you, Daniel," Margaret urged, her voice sharp with urgency. "You've given her enough time. It's time to move on." I froze in place, my hands trembling as I wiped down the counter. Move on? She didn't even see me as a person. To her, I was just a tool, something that had served its purpose and was now disposable. The conversation continued, and my heart sank further as I listened. "If you divorce her now, I'll make sure you walk away with everything," Margaret promised, her tone smooth, almost seductive. The power, the control. She had always believed she could control everything, manipulate every situation. And now she thought she had me cornered. She thought Daniel would choose her over me, and that she could somehow erase me from his life. But what she didn't know was that I had already made my move. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, his soft breathing barely audible in the darkness, I realized that I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel resentment. I felt amusement, because I knew something she didn't. I knew that I had already won, and they just didn't realize it yet. I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to beg Daniel to see the truth. I wasn't going to make a scene. No, I was going to let them think they had won, let them believe that they had pushed me out of the picture. Because nothing was more satisfying than letting your enemies believe they had won, and then watching as everything they thought they had crumble before their eyes. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet tension. Margaret continued her subtle campaign to push me out of Daniel's life. Every conversation felt like a battle, but she was playing a game that she didn't fully understand. As the days went on, I allowed her to believe that I was slowly crumbling under the weight of her words. She thought I was weak, that I was the one who would walk away quietly, head hung in shame. But I was biding my time, watching carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. The phone calls, the text messages, and the whispered conversations in the hallway. They all became routine. Margaret would speak to Daniel, her words laced with concern, like she was trying to save him from the wrong choice. He, in his obliviousness, would laugh it off, not realizing that his mother was systematically poisoning his mind against me. One afternoon, after an exhausting day of work, I received a text from Daniel. "I think we need to talk," it read. I didn't respond immediately. I knew this conversation was coming. It had to. Margaret had made it clear she wanted him to choose her over me, to move on, to find someone better. When Daniel came home that evening, he looked like a man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His face was drawn, his eyes tired, and the smile that usually lit up his face was gone. I could feel the shift in the air as soon as he walked in the door. This wasn't just another casual conversation. This was the moment where everything changed. We sat down on the couch together, and for the first time in years, there was a strange silence between us. He looked at me, trying to gauge my mood, his fingers nervously twisting in his lap. "Claire," he began, his voice hesitant, "I think we should separate." The words hit me like a wave crashing against a cliff. I wasn't surprised, but I was still stunned by the finality of it. There it was, the moment Margaret had been pushing for, the moment Daniel, unknowingly, had allowed her to orchestrate. I didn't react. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just smiled. The smile that surprised him, that confused him. "Oh?" I said softly. "Why?" We just want different things," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm not sure this is working anymore. I need to think about what's best for me." I didn't respond immediately. I was letting the words sink in, letting him realize the depth of what he was saying. "Who is we?" I asked quietly. My heart wasn't racing, but I could feel the tension rising in my chest. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about him and his mother, and the life he had been living in her shadow. He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I tilted my head, studying him. "I mean, is it we, as in you and me, or we, as in you and your mother?" He flinched at the question, unable to hide the discomfort that flashed across his face. "Claire, I didn't mean it like that," he stammered. I stood up, moving to the bedroom, grabbing my suitcase. "I'll give you some space," I said calmly. "I'm going to stay somewhere else for a while." The shock on his face was priceless. "Wait, I didn't mean for you to leave tonight," he said, his voice frantic. "I just thought we should talk. I didn't want you to feel—" "I'm not upset, Daniel," I interrupted, cutting him off. "You've already made your decision." As I packed, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. I wasn't angry, I wasn't heartbroken, I was simply letting the pieces fall where they may. The truth was, I didn't need to fight for something that was already lost. I wasn't leaving him. I was leaving behind the illusion that he was the one who had any control over our lives. I was leaving him to figure out the mess he had created, to see the truth for himself. I stayed that night in a luxury hotel, one that Margaret herself had bragged about attending charity events at, one that she had always viewed as a symbol of success and status. The irony wasn't lost on me. I ordered champagne and sipped it slowly, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Tomorrow, Margaret would wake up thinking she had won, that she had finally gotten rid of me. But by the time she realized what she had truly lost, it would be far too late. The morning after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling of clarity that washed over me. Sitting alone in the hotel room, I sipped my coffee slowly, the quiet of the morning wrapping around me like a warm blanket. It had taken me years to realize it, but in that moment I understood something profound. I had been living my life for other people. I had been trying so hard to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Margaret, Daniel, and even I had all played a part in this game. But I wasn't going to play anymore. I had spent too many years questioning my worth, doubting myself, trying to prove that I was enough for them. But what I didn't realize until now was that I didn't need their approval. I had always been enough. The truth was, I had built my own life. I had worked for everything I had, and I didn't need anyone to validate it. For years, I had been held back by the idea that I needed to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. Margaret had always made me feel like I wasn't good enough, that my background, my upbringing, and even my achievements didn't measure up to her standards. But as I sat in that hotel room, I realized something. It wasn't about her. It was never about her. It was about me, my worth, my power, and my ability to create the life I wanted, regardless of what anyone else thought. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer shrink. I would no longer try to fit into a family that didn't understand or appreciate me. I would stand tall and embrace the life I had built, not for them, but for myself. I had worked hard to get where I was, and it was time I started owning it. Daniel had been a part of that life, yes, but he wasn't the reason I had gotten this far. It was my own drive, my own ambition, and my own belief in myself that had carried me through. I had created a business from the ground up, a home that was truly mine, and a future that was full of possibility. And none of that had been because of anyone else. It had been because of me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had let others define me. Margaret, Daniel, even society. Everyone had their expectations of who I should be, but I had ignored my own voice for too long. I had allowed their opinions to shape my sense of self-worth, to the point where I questioned if I was ever truly good enough. But now I was done. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me who I should be. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel like I wasn't worthy of the life I had created. And as the days passed, I began to feel something inside me shift, a sense of empowerment, of freedom that I had never felt before. I wasn't just walking away from Daniel or Margaret. I was walking away from the version of myself that had allowed their words to define me. I was walking away from the idea that I had to prove anything to anyone. I had already proven enough, to them, to myself, and to the world. And as I sat there in the quiet of the hotel room, I realized that the greatest lesson I had learned through all of this was simple. My worth is not determined by anyone else, it's determined by me. It always has been. Days passed, and the silence between Daniel and I grew. His texts became more frequent, his calls more desperate. He didn't understand why I had left. He didn't realize that the moment he chose his mother over me, the relationship had already crumbled. I wasn't angry with him. I wasn't angry with anyone anymore. I simply didn't have the energy to fight for a love that wasn't real, for a family that would never accept me. One afternoon, I received another message from him. "Claire, we need to talk," it read. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The decision had been made, and deep down I knew it was the right one. I was done trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. I was done fighting for a place in a family that didn't truly want me. I had built my own life, my own success, and now it was time to fully embrace it. Daniel had always been my partner, but it wasn't him who had built this life with me. It was me, alone. Then came the inevitable. Margaret. She reached out, still clinging to the illusion that she could control the situation. "You may have the house, but don't think for a second that you've won," she wrote, her words dripping with spite. "Daniel will recover. He'll find someone better, someone who truly belongs in this family." I smiled as I read it. Margaret still thought this was about the house, about the material things she believed made her powerful. But it wasn't. It had never been about that. It was about finding my own voice, my own strength, and realizing that I had everything I needed all along. A week later, I received a call from a mutual friend. "You won't believe it," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Daniel lost his job. It's all over." I didn't feel a rush of satisfaction. I didn't feel gloating. I felt relief. The burden had been lifted, not because they suffered, but because I was free. Free from the manipulation, free from the control, free from the lies. A year later, I hosted a small gathering in my boutique, my empire. Not to gloat, not to rub it in their faces, but to celebrate my growth. Surrounded by women who had supported me, who had believed in me from the start, I finally felt at home. Margaret and Daniel never reached out again. Their world, once so neatly arranged, had fallen apart, and I was still standing, stronger than ever. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. My worth is not determined by anyone else's expectations. It's defined by me, and I was finally living a life that was truly mine.